Good evening. My name is Mark Barnico. I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Ewan campus here in Hong Kong. Welcome to the U.S. Presidential Election Series for 2024. As always, we're sharing tonight's event via Zoom, and Facebook, and YouTube. And if audience members have questions to submit, you can do so through the question and answer button by first registering on Zoom. I also encourage you to visit our UChicago Hong Kong campus website at www.uchicago.hk to subscribe to the e-news for the latest UChicago and Hong Kong campus news and information. We kicked off this series in September with our lead faculty, Professor Robert Pape, discussing the violent populism in America. Tonight, Professor Pape returns to moderate this program with two UChicago political science faculty to discuss the geopolitical and international economic implications of the U.S. presidential election. Let's start tonight with a brief introduction of our speakers. Once again, thank you, Professor Pape, for joining us. Professor Pape is in the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago and the founding director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. His research focuses on international security affairs and political violence. Robert Gulotty is an associate professor of political science at the University of Chicago. His research examines the relationship between national governments and global markets. His publications include Narrowing the Channel, the Politics of Regulatory Protection, and Trade and Public Policies, a closer look at non-tariff measures in the 21st century. Paul Poast is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Committee on International Relations at the University of Chicago. He studies international politics, focusing on international security, diplomacy, and the use of data to study international relations. He's the author and co-author of 3 books, Arguing About Alliances, The Art of Agreement in Military Pact Negotiations, Organizing Democracy, How International Organizations Assist New Democracies, and The Economics of War. You can find links to each of the professors' books on our event webpage this evening. I also wanted to just mention that each of the professors are affiliates of the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats, and Professor Pape will mention more about that in a bit. All of these professors are now featured on our podcast, The Course. Please check out the interviews after the program tonight, and you can learn more about each of the professors' career stories and how they became professors. I want to thank each of you for joining us tonight. Professors, I'll hand the stage over to Professor Pape to get us started this evening.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you to Professor Gulotty, Professor Post for doing this program tonight. And thank you for all of you who are joining us. This evening, we have really quite an extraordinary opportunity. As I'm sure you all know, the election in the United States is pitting candidates whose views on foreign policy are literally, on multiple dimensions, worlds apart. And tonight, we really have an amazing opportunity to discuss with some of the world's leading experts in international economics and international geopolitics, some critical questions about how this election will impact international politics, especially in Asia. For example, how will the election impact the structure of international power, the order in Asia, especially between China and the United States? How will it impact the likelihood of international conflict, especially between China and Taiwan and also the South China Sea? How will it impact international economic relations? How much in particular would Trump's new tariff policies really matter? And then what are we all missing? What issues do the experts really think about that are not currently front and center? Well, tonight, we're going to have a chance to do deep dives into this and much, much more. We're going to go in order. Professor Gulotty is going to go first. Then he will speak for about 15 or 20 minutes. Then we'll turn it to Professor Post, who will do the same. Then we'll have question and answers. You can go to the chat and you can start to populate questions along the way. And I will do my best to try to keep up with your questions. So without further ado, let's turn to Professor Gulotty.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Pape. As the first speaker, I see my role in part as introducing the sort of international relations frameworks that the two parties are putting forward to begin to get a sense of the stakes of this election. And then I'm going to dive into the consequences for international politics and international economic affairs in particular. So to begin with, my name is Robert Gulotty. I study international political economy. I'm an affiliate of Poast as well as the PhD in political economy here at the University of Chicago and a member of the Department of Political Science. To begin with, what I'll do is unpack a little basic insight into the two-party candidate positions. So number one, we have Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is the current vice president, and her foreign policy is a strong belief in continuation of the post-war liberal consensus. That means like American leadership, that the US benefits from global security are greater than the cost, the belief that America should be a leader in the world, a commitment to liberalism in a weak sense. Liberalism here means limited government, equal protection under the law, access to education, public goods for all, regardless of various identity considerations like gender, race. And the idea that this is the right way of living, not just for the United States, but for the world. So this is a commitment to a belief of, some might call it human rights. In the United States, we're not really committed to that language so much, but we have this basic understanding that we have the right way of living, at least at the basic level, and we want everyone to enjoy that. Third is a sense of the geopolitics that kind of characterizes the contemporary era, where most of the world is our potential friends, but right now we're facing a geopolitical rivalry with China. So the current administration and past administrations have been committed to seeing geopolitics in terms of rivalries and competitors, and that's going to continue under the Harris foreign policy. And finally, we can think of one of the main parts of the post-war liberal consensus being that alliances are a fundamental part of American foreign policy, that the United States, quote unquote, won the Cold War through strong commitments to its allies. Now, I say that this is a continuation of the post-war liberal consensus because Harris served as vice president under Biden, and realistically, this is just the way that every president has continued policy with small deviations. So like, it's a pretty good guess that America is going to continue from the past. But we've seen many administrations in the last decades begin to disagree with parts of the post-war consensus. In particular, in the area that I study, and we'll talk about this in some depth, trade can be a force for inequity, and compensation that we've had in the world is insufficient for Americans. Trade is no longer seen as an unalloyed good that promotes liberalism, one of the principles of the post-war liberal consensus. Second, that there's a stronger role for the state in managing economic affairs. In the Cold War, the notion that the government would play an important role in the economy was seen as a concession to socialism. But now, on both sides of the aisle, both Republicans and Democrats have accepted that there's going to be a stronger role for the state in industrial policy of some sort. And that has consequences for the rest of the world, as I'll get into. And finally, there's this idea that not only is China a geopolitical rival, but something more needs to be done to counterbalance China. Going as far to agree with some on the other side of the aisle, on the Republican side, that there might be efforts that need to be taken to undercut Chinese economic growth, not only to meet it in a competitive fashion. And finally, there's the litany of policy areas that the Biden administration had and the Harris administration would likely continue. The pro-Israel default position, pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-Iran nuclear deal, even though reviving it somehow, but that general idea of spending political capital to try to prevent Iran from nuclearizing, anti-Putin and anti-Assad. So these are the broad swaths of Harris foreign policy, but that's based on what has been happening so far under the Biden administration, some sense of like where Democratic foreign policy is coming from. But to really understand where Harris will be coming from, it might be necessary to think a little bit more about what sort of experts the Harris administration would rely on. And one hint of that would be Harris's current national security advisor, Philip H. Gordon, who has written many, many books on the subject of international politics, and I would say is an internationalist, thus reinforcing the ideas on the previous page, but increasingly a Russia hawk and believes that we're in a second Cold War. Not necessarily saying that we need to escalate conflicts with Russia, but seeing them as a core geopolitical rival in a way that past democratic administrations have tried to reset. Harris is also committed to continued spending on the military, so it's unlikely that we'll see any fundamental change in American military supremacy. And of course, the continued Biden policies of industrial policy, made in America sort of protectionism, the use of tariffs not as a economic tool, but as a tool for sanctions to enforce other political goals, and a loose but vocal commitment to international law. I say loose because, there's limits to what the U.S. will do to actually enforce international law or particularly have it bind to itself, but it's part of the language that the Harris administration uses to understand, Harris campaign and the Biden administration have used to justify their own foreign policies. So that's sort of a continuation of much of the same as what we've seen in the past, I would say. But what's the alternative? What's at stake here? We have an election that's basically 50-50. What's the other possibility? And that's Trump. So the Trump foreign policy, we've seen it before, so we have a pretty good insight into what it'll look like. I think that's governed by three principles. Nationalism, that every government's only obligation is to its own people and not to other ideals that expand beyond the borders of the nation or its citizens. Second, populism, that power should be in the people and not corrupt globalist elites, and that the cause of many of the world's ills are because national wealth has been given away by corrupt globalist leaders of various countries. And third, America first. America first in two senses. First, America is the target and appropriate way to start all discussions in terms of what our priorities should be. First, make sure that America's getting as much as it can out of any deal. And second, that the benefits of global security, the commitments to the post-war global liberal order have been, the benefits have been exaggerated and the costs have been underestimated. Basically, the benefits of global security primarily accrue to people outside the United States, not inside the United States, and the costs that the United States have borne are too much. In part, justifying this and an extension of these ideas, I believe, is a certain form of folk realism. I call it folk realism because I'm not saying it's like a sophisticated account of international relations, but one that you might come to as a non-expert, as a non-politician, not someone who's not really engaged in this sort of world and entering politics for the first time late in life. That international relations is a zero-sum game. Any loss from an enemy is a gain to us. Any loss to the United States is a gain to our enemies. That foreign policy is primarily about brinkmanship, bargaining, and transactions. This comes both from Trump's business career as well as growing up during a particular era in the Cold War. And a particularly unique thing about the Trump perspective on things is that bilateral relations, which enable you to do brinkmanship, bargaining, and transactions more easily, are the appropriate tool for foreign policy, and that multilateral institutions, international law, are weapons of the weak designed to trick Americans and enable globalists to give away national wealth. So that's sort of a folk realism. And then finally, the feature of the Trump foreign policy I think gets underappreciated in the United States, but I think is quite obvious for anybody outside of it, is that Trump is approaching all politics, in particular international politics, in a transactional way. We can see this in his characterization of what went wrong with the invasion of Ukraine. When Russia invades Ukraine, Trump places the blame squarely on the shoulders of Biden because Biden didn't know how to cut a deal. In particular, he wasn't willing to give up the things necessary to prevent a war. So we can see that in the way he talked about it. He saw Putin, he saw him building up the soldiers, and he thought, for Trump, this is his statements, he must be negotiating. So we're going to have to give up lots of things in order to prevent his invasion. Well, Biden didn't know how to do that. He didn't know how to talk to him. And everything they said was weak and stupid. They said the wrong things, and so the war broke out. But if the U.S. had been willing to make the right concessions, the war would never have started. Those concessions could be at the cost of Ukrainian sovereignty or whatever, but the idea is that the wars and everything else is part of a transaction, and the transaction can be done successfully or it can be done stupidly. Where does this come from? It dates well back in history to the 1980s. This is a full-page ad that Donald Trump spent $100,000 of his own money in 1987 dollars to place in major newspapers, in which he identifies that the problem of the world is that America is overestimating the benefits of global peace, and that all the other countries that benefit from that global peace ought to be paying for it. As he put it, we protect ships we don't even own, carrying oil we don't need because the oil is physically going to other countries. Again, this is a rejection of the notion of markets. I'll get into this later. And destined for allies who won't put up for their own security. So the idea is we should make all of the allies of the world that we extend all these benefits to pay. And he posits we should tax them, but it's not clear exactly how. I think today he would say the way to do that is with tariffs. And I think this logic is what's being extended to the world. Essentially that the world's safety benefits them more than it benefits us. Remember, it's a zero-sum world. And so in order to make things more equal and fair, these countries should be paying the United States for their protection. Something like a protection racket that you might see in certain real estate deals in some neighborhoods in New York. So what might happen to the global economy if the two parties, one party or the other party gets elected? So the first thing is, what policies will they enact? Just like, what are they going to do? It's not always clear in foreign policy that you can predict what's going to happen. So, we're going to talk about basically general tendencies, and then in the particulars will depend on world events. The picture that I'm showing here is a picture of the RB Eden, a ship that was destined to China carrying sorghum. And then in the announcement of the Chinese retaliatory tariffs was forced to turn around the coast, around Africa, and go find new markets in Europe. These are the consequences of tariff wars. They literally have to turn the ships around. Now, Trump's main plan is to escalate and continue a trade war. Escalate in the sense that it's not just going to be on China, it's going to be on the entire planet. And it's going to increase the tariffs on China dramatically, if we were to believe anything he was saying here. By contrast, Harris appears to have a two-pronged approach. First, a series of protectionist subsidies for targeted industries, so not every industry, but rather specific declared national security industries, such as creating a national stockpile of critical minerals, and continuing to do Buy America, and trying to create leadership, U.S. leadership in bioengineering, AI, and clean energy. At the same time, there will be a restriction of unfair trade. There's a characterization on the Democratic Party of like unfair trade. Their word for it is, their examples usually come from the experience of China, but flooding the market with steel, the inferior steel, preventing the ability for Americans to compete abroad, unfairly subsidizing shipbuilding. So the idea that there's a fair way of doing international markets and an unfair one, and other countries might be doing the unfair one. And then, of course, the long-standing concern the U.S. has with foreign intellectual property protections, hurting small businesses with counterfeits. All of this has been priorities of America forever, and those will continue. But there's some new areas where they see ways in which other countries are trying to get around our various protections. For example, there's this direct-to-consumer shipping process where they're sending small packets of clothes directly to consumers, like Shine. And this is they're going to restrict the de minimis exemption that those businesses rely on in order to evade U.S. tariffs. But that's just what they're going to do. What are the consequences going to mean for the world? I want to give you a little bit of perspective, okay? So U.S. tariffs have varied dramatically over the course of its history. It used to be, prior to the 1940s, every time the Democrats were in power, they would cut tariffs, and every time the Republicans were in power, they would raise tariffs. And that's this sort of fluctuation that you see prior to the 1920s. 1930s, with the destruction of the Republican Party by the Great Depression, the Democrats managed to enact a series of reforms that embedded trade policy into foreign policy, making it much more difficult to do this sort of, depending on who's in power, raise or lower tariffs, because now all the countries in the world can retaliate. We'll get into this later. As a result, we haven't seen tariffs above 10%, that's the blue line, since 1945. We haven't seen it anywhere near 10% since 1945. So it's been a long time since we've had significant tariffs on US markets. At the same time, you heard about the protectionism that happened under the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, that's on the right. And we can see that the average customs duties went from 1.5% to 3%, which is a doubling of the tariffs, but still nowhere near the levels that they were in the 40s or 50s even. Now the proposal is not to bring it up to 3%, but rather 20%, which would be equivalent to 1930 Smoot-Hawley tariff levels, and one in which would be dramatically different than anything we've experienced in the past. Just to give you a sense of like what the consequences of the past tariff war were, in 2015, imports from China were $483 billion, that's before the trade war. They were $449 billion during the trade war, and they're currently, despite the fact that the Biden administration has maintained many of the tariffs on China, $536 billion of imports to the United States from China. So some of that's inflation, but like the general idea is we haven't actually seen the trade war, despite the fact that it's hurt particular sectors and particular products. We haven't seen a wide based tariff schedule the way that the Trump administration or the Trump campaign is promising to do. That's just a little bit of context for you. So I think this time would be different, and it would reinvigorate a global trade war. Some of this we've seen what it would look like by looking at the particular products that were targeted under the previous administration. We saw a collapse in US farm prices. We saw trade diversion to Southeast Asia for countries that were not covered by the tariff. And we saw the cycle of retaliation between the US and China. The difference is that the trade tariff wall that's being proposed here would apply to all trading partners and not just China. And that might mean that there's less trade diversion. We'll see less business going to Vietnam, less business going to other partners within Asia, but maybe not, because the reality is the 20% tariff would result in retaliation by all of US trading partners, but that retaliation will be uneven because some countries can't really credibly commit to raising the prices on American products, either because they don't consume any or because they can't afford to do so. So the amount of retaliation will vary even if the US tariff is flat across all countries. And the degree of retaliation will be greater in general than anything we've seen in the past, in part because all countries will be unified in opposition to US policy. So no one will feel left out in targeting the United States with protection. Why would this happen? Why would Trump actually want to do any of this? I would think it's useful to think a little bit about the motivations that Trump takes to trade policy. And there are three, and I want to talk about each one because it helps us understand what's going on and what the likely consequences will be. First is going to be protection. Second, commitment to revenue. And third is leverage. So the first motivation for protection is the oldest. It's the claim that under their plans, American workers don't have to worry about losing their jobs to foreign nations. So this is a slightly different take on protectionism than in the past. In the past, it was recognized that protection was important for particular industries. It was about one industry versus another, taking money from farmers to consumers or from consumers to workers, and a recognition that somebody in society isn't getting the fair deal. They need prices to go up to protect the American farmer. They need prices to go down to protect the American consumer. And the old protectionism was more sophisticated in the sense that it talked about those trade-offs between groups within societies. The new Trump mercantilism is more simple than that. I guess at Wharton, he read somewhere that imports subtract from GDP. And that imports are only to be tolerated because other countries won't let the US export otherwise. So let me dive into that idea here. So here's the GDP expenditure function. It says GDP is a function of household consumption, private investment, government spending, gross exports, and gross imports. And you'll see that there's a little negative sign on gross imports. So from an accounting principle, you might think, oh yeah, imports decrease GDP, because I know enough algebra from, again, the military academy that I went to or whatever, that when I got to Wharton and I see a minus sign on imports, I learn imports are bad. And a commentator, Matthew Iglesias, has talked to dozens of people within the Trump administration who report that Trump believes that imports subtract from GDP, and that's why he likes tariffs. And according to Matthew Iglesias, this means that everybody who's trying to give like sophisticated accounts of what's going on here will never do a good job, because Trump's actually committed to putting a 20% tax on Kenyan coffee and bananas that have no benefit to American producers in any significant way. This perspective is contrary to all reason, because of course, tariffs don't just affect imports, it affects everything else in this equation. A majority of imports are inputs to US manufacturing. Tariffs raise costs, reducing private investment. Tariffs raise prices, reducing the purchasing power of consumers, reducing C. And tariffs will induce retaliation, cutting off exports and reducing X. So if you think of all these other variables as fixed features and not affected by the tariff, then it sort of makes sense. But if you think about it from a general equilibrium market perspective, which this equation is designed to do, then it's clear that like you can't just isolate the little negative sign and make predictions about how tariffs are going to affect the overall economy. I don't think that sophisticated account is what's driving his personal commitment to protections. All right, the second motivation is a belief that tariffs are revenue. As he says, he's a tariff man. This is connected to his notion that that the international relations is a zero-sum game, and that when countries come in to raid the great wealth of the nation, they want to pay for the privilege of doing so. And the way he's going to tax those other countries is with the tariff. And he's really proud of the fact that for 10 months during the trade war, China was paying tariffs of 25% on $50 billion of high tech and 10% on $200 billion of other goods. And he thinks that the payments themselves, the cash that's taken in, the revenues, are responsible for any positive economic experiences under his presidency. So he thinks we're going to take in trillions of dollars, and that'll pay for childcare for people. It'll make people much happier. And that it can help, if you recall from the first administration, it'll help build the wall. So the claim is tariffs are taxes that raise revenue that can be used to pay for government expenditures, which is true. The downside is that tariffs are not an effective revenue stream. Imports are about 15% of US GDP. And so there's no way to make up the revenue needs of the federal government, let alone expand them. Because tariffs, of course, are going to reduce the amount of trade you do anyway. So that's an actual motivation that he claims to have. Whether or not he really believes this is another question. It's really hard to tell. Finally, and this is what I think people underappreciate about the Trump administration and the Trump campaign, is that tariffs are really great because they offer you leverage. Every tariff wall will come with what are called exclusions. We see here a picture of Tim Cook begging for access to the American market for his products, and Trump was happy to oblige so long as he would support him politically. This also gives you leverage with foreign governments, as he can require them to get memberships to Mar-a-Lago to, again, beg for exemptions to the tariff wall. Japan was forced to make such a presentation in one of its diplomatic visits. It also gives you, as the Tim Cook example shows, leverage versus individual firms, both abroad and within the United States. And during the Trump steel tariffs in particular, the U.S. Department of Commerce internal inspectors found that the decision-making were subject to lots of quote-unquote unofficial appeals over hundreds of undocumented meetings and conversation, just rife for graft. The cool thing about a tariff is it hurts everyone except for your friends, because you can give them exemptions unilaterally as the president. Trump, in fact, holds these meetings at Mar-a-Lago to hear petitions for relief. So it's a sort of an extortion racket that can be used by the president personally. And I think that's behind all the bluster about revenue for the world and paying all these taxes or whatnot, this is the most exciting thing for a hypothetical Trump administration. Okay, so what will this mean for East Asia, in my judgment? First, unlike the first round of the trade war, Trump round 2 will negatively affect Vietnam, Malaysia, and others who are winners in the first round. By targeting China in particular, it had a lot of trade diversionary effects across East Asia and Southeast Asia, benefiting a lot of other countries. Most vulnerable firms will be those that are high profile, get on his radar, and he has to can extract as much from to get the exemptions that they'll need to get around the trade wall. This will include things that are particularly sensitive from a domestic political standpoint, including Chinese electrical vehicle manufacturers and commodity producers, because a lot of the commodity producers are tight with the Trump team. All of this, however, creates opportunities to play on Trump's transactional politics. If you're willing to get the membership in Mar-a-Lago and give up a little bit for him personally, then you might be able to survive this without too much cost. The Harris administration will continue to maintain the existing barriers for the hope that they can negotiate using that as a tool to other countries. That's called reciprocity, where the U.S. will lower its tariffs in exchange for others lowering theirs. There'll be a continued aggressive use of Section 301 tariffs against China and others that we see as acting unfairly in the global market. And Harris will probably enact some minor trade deals, but nothing significant, kind of continuing the normal order of slow progress in establishing alliances and friends abroad. And I actually think that the Harris administration would be likely to copy an EU carbon border adjustment policy. That is, they'll enact new tariffs that are justified not on economic grounds, but rather on climate grounds, as the EU has recently. That will be particularly harmful for cement manufacturers and aluminum manufacturers and steel manufacturers across East Asia and Southeast Asia that will suffer from not having an internal emission trading system or cap and trade scheme that would exempt you from such tariffs. Okay, now to get at Professor Pape's question, what are the underappreciated risks associated with this election? I think one important underappreciated risk, because it's basically invisible, is the power that the president has over the appointment process and staffing of the executive body. So in a Heritage Foundation policy brief called Project 2025, which became a sort of shibboleth for the two parties to fight about identity politics, there are also interesting things in there about governing. And in particular, there's a claim that the State Department is ineffective, and its ineffectiveness is because it's not aligned sufficiently with the president. The belief, the institutional belief that has emerged in the State Department, that they're somehow experts on foreign affairs, that they're an independent institution that knows what's best for the United States, sets its own foreign policy, and doesn't need direction from the elected president. This has a lot of consequences for both parties, both administrations, both the Biden and the previous Trump administration. For Trump, they were interfering with his graft schemes. And for Harris, they're blocking various protectionist policies as well. So both parties want this, but looks like the Trump administration would go further by using acting appointments. So, appointing pending confirmation. So you don't need to go to Congress anymore. You don't need to go to the Senate and get approval for the people you put in power. And so you can put people who are particularly responsive to the president's interests. You can place political appointees in positions that don't require Senate confirmation. That means you rely more on your principal deputy assistant secretaries, your deputy assistant secretaries to do foreign policy rather than people who are requiring some oversight by Senate before they can get their job. And this is an interesting little quirk. In addition to removing all the political ambassadors, many ambassadors, including the one in the lower right here, the ambassador to Iceland, are basically donors to the parties. And that's normal, and both parties do this pretty regularly. But there's also people who are career ambassadors. And for they're recommending removing all of them too, to get different career ambassadors with the hope that they realize that they should be more sensitive to the president's interests. All of this arises from the theory of the unitary executive, which fits Trump's interests in particular, is run hundreds of private firms that are responsive only to himself. And so there's sort of an alignment between a particular theory of policymaking and governance that aligns with his previous experience. And of course, this is all related to a broader populist term because only the president in the executive office is actually elected. And so this is placing the power of voters and the masses and the public over elites, the globalist elites that have sold out the country to others. The consequence of this, I think, will be less capacity to handle emergent or technical problems, probably a higher risk of miscalculation and miscommunication. And as you see in foreign policy every day, there's a lot of things that happen. And it may lead to prioritizing short-term wins for the particular interests of the president over longer-term projects that could benefit future administrations that aren't as important to the current administration. So that's what I have to say about the broad overview of the two parties' positions and some of the consequences on the international economic side.
Professor Gulotty, that was absolutely fantastic. A bit scary to think we're on the verge of a global trade war, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1930s. Now we're going to transition to Professor Poast. There are already questions coming in, Professor Poast, about security. And I think the audience, this is no better person to talk about those issues. Please, Professor Poast.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Pate. And that was outstanding from Professor Gulotty there. I was taking a bunch of notes, so that was fantastic in terms of laying things out. I was very familiar with the 1987 full-page ad, so I love that you brought that in. I hadn't made the connection with the classic macro equation, so I love that. That's, I learned something new, and hopefully our audience did as well. So yes, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be setting out kind of more specifically the security implications regarding this election. So as I said, what I'm going to do is, I thought Professor Gulotty did a great job of kind of starting off by situating everything specifically or more generally about the two general foreign policy dispositions of the two candidates. I'm going to come back to that. And, there might even be some ways in which I absolutely agree with Professor Gulotty, but I also might have some disagreement with him, which that's not unusual. He and I are both from the Midwest, kind of like the two vice presidential candidates the other night. So of course we're going to kind of politely agree and also disagree with each other, just like we witnessed the other evening. But what I want to talk about is, and you can see from the title here, is an election in a world at war. And I think this is a very useful way for kind of thinking about the broader security implications that could unfold from this election, and then also thinking more specifically about what this would mean for Asia and specifically East Asia in a security framework. So to start off, during Donald Trump's acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention, he made the following statement. He said, "There is an international crisis, the likes of which the world has seldom been part of. Nobody can believe what's happening. War is now raging in Europe, in the Middle East. A growing specter of conflict hangs over Taiwan, Korea, the Philippines, all over Asia, and our planet is teetering on the edge of World War III. And this will likely be a war like no other war because of weaponry. The weapons are no longer tanks, army tanks going back and forth, shooting each other. The weapons are obliteration," of course, referencing, of course, nuclear weapons. And this is a statement that, of course, this is from his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention, but he has gone on to make similar statements, including during his debate with Vice President Harris. And here's the thing. He's not wrong. He is not wrong in making this statement. I wrote in November a piece for The Atlantic titled "Not a World War, but a World at War." And the argument that I put forward in that piece is that the past 2 years, 2022 and 2023, and guess what? 2024 is no exception to this trend, that the past 2 years have witnessed more conflicts in the world than any year since the end of the Second World War. And so in many ways, what Trump was saying is not wrong. And this is drawn on data from UCDP, the Uppsala Conflict Data Project. And what they do is they collect data going back to 1945. There's another similar project called the Correlates of War Project, where they collect data on wars that are happening around the world. And what this data has shown is that This is the most conflicts happening in the world since 1945. At first, I thought, oh, it was since the end of the Cold War, but it actually goes back that far. Now, of course, and hence the title of that work, that piece I wrote, we are not witnessing World War II. We're not witnessing World War I. We're not in a world war, a single unified multi-continent spanning conflict between great powers. We are not witnessing that, but we are witnessing a record number of wars that are spanning across the world, that are happening in various regions and are at various intensities. Some of these are interstate wars. Some of these, of course, are internal wars. To give you further context on this, you can also look at, this is from another one of the data projects, kind of giving you a sense of the different, this is actually coming from ECLID, which is another one of these data projects that collects data on where conflicts are happening around the world. And this is just highlighting some of the various hotspots, if you will. And I think for anyone who has a familiarity, they would realize that, okay, not all of these conflicts are, of course, your classic interstate wars. Say, for example, Mexico is much more conflict between the government and, say, cartels. But, of course, we also have Ukraine here, which is your classic interstate war. Palestine, Israel being highlighted there. So when we're thinking about war, we're not just thinking about the classic interstate war. We're thinking about all conflicts happening around the world. And there's further data that they've used to kind of show this. 1 in 6 people are exposed to conflict in 2024. That is quite a high number. Again, a level that hasn't been witnessed in decades. And so all of these data together help to highlight the fact that we are in a world at war rather than a world war. And so that's just a way of saying that Trump wasn't wrong in what he was saying, but it also helps to set the stakes for what could unfold following this election. Specifically, how could or how will the next president handle this situation and operate given that we are in a world at war? Now, of course, highlighting all these conflicts is notable, and you can see that the Philippines is highlighted here. But one region that hasn't received quite as much attention, though Trump did mention in his speech, is, of course, the region of East Asia, South China Sea. And this is a region that, out of all the conflicts that are happening right now, is most poised that if a war were to break out, it could be a war that is larger than all of these other wars. This is the region where there is a risk of kind of sparking what people would consider to be World War III. And this is something that, of course, we have been witnessing lots of tension in this region, acts of war, such as being phrased, acts of aggression by China towards its neighbors. And I'm going to come back to this at the end of my talk. But that is what's notable, is that all of the conflict happening in the world, the one region where we are not witnessing as much of the conflict, but is most poised to possibly generate the largest conflict, is, of course, the region of China with its neighbors. And I should say that that is broadly defined. We could be talking about war with Japan. We could be talking about, of course, an invasion with Taiwan. We could even be talking about conflict between India and China. All of these are potential flashpoints where China is at the center. And understanding how either Harris or Trump could handle that type of situation is really important for us to be moving forward. So that's kind of the question. Who is better situated to address a world at war? Well, when it comes to this, it's interesting to first notice the similarities, and that both Harris and Trump see the United States as the indispensable nation. Now, of course, this is relying on the phrase that's associated with former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And Madeleine Albright used this phrase to talk about in the 1990s about how the United States is the indispensable nation. To solve the problems of the world, the U.S. has to be involved. Maybe the U.S. doesn't always have to take the lead, but the U.S. has to be involved. What is notable is that they actually both hold this view, but they have different visions of what that means. They have very different visions of what that means. But that is one, I think, an important starting point for thinking about this. So let's unpack it a little bit. And I think a good way to unpack it is actually start with a baseline. And the baseline is Biden. Reason why? Because when we can think about how does Biden view the world, given that he is, of course, president during this time of a world at war? Well, I would label that the Biden doctrine, if you will, and of course, IR scholars and policymakers love to use the phrase doctrine to describe the foreign policy of a U.S. president. You know, what is the Bush doctrine? What was the Obama doctrine? Well, the Biden doctrine, I say, is realpolitik with an internationalist flair. Okay. And what that means is he does very much believe in engaging the world. He used phrases such as America is back when he became president. And it also means containing and managing rivals, not defeating them. But it's very much a Cold War mentality. And that's where the realpolitik comes in. He is very much still centered on, is this in U.S. interests? And if it's in U.S. interest, then I'm going to pursue it. If it's not, then we might have to take another approach. And what that means is that can lead to inconsistencies in your foreign policy. Of course, an individual who's very much famously associated with realpolitik when it comes to U.S. foreign policy is Henry Kissinger, who recently passed. And it was notorious that in Henry Kissinger's foreign policy, there were a lot of contradictions. But the reason why is because it goes back to the famous phrase by Palmerston, the former British prime minister and foreign minister, where he said that there are no permanent allies, there's only permanent interests. And that is very much a view that Biden has, despite arguing about the U.S. being back, is that can actually lead to the U.S. to have kind of these contradictions, because at the end of the day, it's really about countering U.S. adversaries. And that can lead to different approaches vis-a-vis various countries. Now, what's notable, of course, is this notion of the U.S. being engaged internationally was just recently, and by recently meaning this week, which some people have pointed out maybe isn't the best timing, but his Secretary of State just published a piece in Foreign Affairs this week called America's Strategy for Renewal, Building Leadership for a New World. And this, again, points to this notion of that internationalist flair in Biden's foreign policy. Now, what's notable is, the reason why I want to use this as a baseline is because when it comes to Trump, in a specific Trump 2, it's not all that dissimilar. It's realpolitik with a nationalist flair. I like how Professor Gulotty used the folk realism phrase. I thought that this is kind of the same idea with it. But it's still very much this notion of there's no permanent allies, no permanent enemies, there's just permanent interests. But in his case, it's doing the minimum to keep issues abroad from causing problems at home. So whereas a Biden foreign policy would be like, okay, we're going to have to engage because we have this problem here and this problem here. The Trump administration also is very much about U.S. interests, but it's about what is the minimum that we really have to do, right? And can we offload this onto somebody else? That's kind of one way to think about this. And it's also very much a slogan-based foreign policy. Drill, baby, drill. Build a wall. Tariff man. Deal maker. These are all phrases he continually uses to talk about how he will approach things. But when it comes to building a wall, drill, baby, drill, these are very much focused on the U.S. kind of equipping itself, perhaps at the expense of allies. And of course, tariff man is something that Professor Gulotty just very well laid out, as well as the deal maker notion. And that deal maker can mean kind of cutting deals that might, if you looked at them as a collection, say they kind of contradict each other, and they might actually lead you to leave an ally hanging. But that's the nature of this kind of realpolitik approach with more of a nationalist flair as opposed to an internationalist flair. And of course, the most famous of his slogan of all is his slogan, America First, right? That is the slogan he very much uses and I think captures this idea. Now, if you were to sit there, if you're listening to this and you say, well, it doesn't sound like maybe there's like a difference in rhetoric, but it doesn't sound like the Biden administration and the Trump administration is like wholly all that different foreign policy. I would tend to agree with you. I think there has been a lot of similarities between the first Trump administration and the Biden administration. Now, Professor Gulotty laid out a way, especially on the economic side, where we could see dramatic difference with a second Trump administration. But the other possibility is that the second Trump administration would just simply be a replay of the first, which is a lot of this nationalistic flair played on it, and there would be some tendency towards it, but overall would be a realpolitik type foreign policy. Now, what about Harris? Well, of course, I also, like Professor Gulotty, we did not coordinate on this. We have a picture of Harris with President Zelensky, but I think it very much captures this idea of Harris's approach. But I would say that Harris, for me, it's different. There's not going to be potentially as much of a realpolitik view like there would be with Biden or Trump, but be more of a value-based internationalist would be a way that I would phrase it. What do I mean by that? I think that there's a potential that she would be much more focused on human rights. And this was something that was touched on a little bit with Professor Gulotty's discussion, rather than just simply interest alone. And what this would mean is that the U.S. could do more internationally to defend the defenseless, assist the needy. And this is actually captured by statements that she has made on the campaign trail. This is captured by statements she has made in interviews where she has talked about the efforts that she has made to promote human rights across the world within the United States, and has put much more of an emphasis on that than, say, even her current boss. Like, for example, with the case of the war in Gaza, she has made statements that are much more pro-Palestine and pro-Palestinian than, say, Biden himself has, and has been more open about that. So that is one way in which you could see where this kind of more of a value placed on the protection of human rights would be more in line with her foreign policy. Now, there's also a potential wild cards. What are the wild cards? Well, one of them you can see I have labeled right here, which is Harris the Hawk. And what does this mean? Well, this actually builds on some of the international relations research that has been done by other scholars. One of the things that international relations scholars have pinpointed and highlighted when they've looked at the foreign policy behavior of other women leaders, and of course, U.S. has never had a woman as a U.S. president. Now, if you ask me my prediction, I think we will very soon, but one of the things they have found is that it tends that a lot of times women tend to become more hawkish as foreign policy leaders, largely due to two circumstances. One of those circumstances is that they tend to need to feel like they have to play against stereotypes. The stereotype is that, oh, a woman's going to be perceived as weak, therefore they're going to come on stronger, right? A classic example of this would be Margaret Thatcher. But the other idea behind it is that because of the perception that a woman is weaker, the foreign leaders will be less willing to, say, make a deal, or be less willing to put forward a favorable deal, will thereby force the woman leader to have to push harder on an issue and actually take more coercive measures. And this is something that has been found by a variety of international relations scholars who have studied this issue. And you can actually see a little bit of this in Harris's own rhetoric. This was actually from her campaign. Standing with our allies, we stand up to dictators and we lead on the world stage. As commander-in-chief, she will ensure the United States military remains the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world. That we unleash the power of American innovation and win the competition for the 21st century. That we strengthen, not abdicate our global leadership. That's very strong language, especially this notion of maintaining a lethal fighting force around the world. But again, you could see where there would be a need to have to kind of put forward this more hawkish view and this more hawkish approach. And indeed, you have heard Trump, even during the debates, make those kind of more dismissive comments, the kind that have been highlighted by scholars that can lead to a more hawkish approach by a woman who's in a leadership position on the world stage. And so that is one thing that could actually unfold with Harris. Now, what's the wild card with Trump? It's his ego. With Trump, his ego is the big wild card. And in this case here, it was well documented that during the first Trump administration, he was very susceptible to leaders kind of cozying up to him and playing to his ego as a way of kind of making him more internationalist than he would be otherwise. This was something that Stoltenberg, the Secretary of General for NATO, did so well, so much so that people even said that Stoltenberg should have received a Nobel Peace Prize because of the way that he actually played to Trump's ego to say, oh yes, Trump, the allies are not spending enough, they need to spend more, and because of Trump, they are spending more. It doesn't matter that the allies were already going to be spending more because of the Wales Agreement. What mattered was Stoltenberg actually played to Trump's ego to say, no, it's because of Trump that NATO allies are spending more. And by the end of Trump's term, he was actually saying, I saved NATO. NATO's great now because of me, right? So that was an example of this. The other example was Abe in Japan. This was something that in many ways was his biggest foreign policy accomplishment, as captured by the photo here, where they're both holding up hats that say, make U.S. American-Japan relations great again, right? Was that he really played. He was the first world leader to reach out to Trump. And he made it a point of recognizing that Trump is someone who might be very skeptical of Japan, might be skeptical of the relationship with Japan. He played to that ego as a way to kind of bring Trump on board. And I could see something similar unfolding as a potential wild card here, that you could see, for example, Zelensky and others playing to him saying, you know what, only you can stand up to Putin. You're actually the one who can do it. Putin's actually scared of you. And that might actually lead a Trump to be even more hawkish towards Russia and even more support of Ukraine. Not saying this could happen, but it's something that we've witnessed. And so these are two things that I think really need to be paid attention to when thinking about how either leader could potentially behave on the world stage. So the last thing I want to go into before I'm done here, I have a couple minutes left, is just talk about now, how could all of this mean, what could all this mean for the conflict that could actually be the largest conflict in a world at war? And that is the possibility of conflict where the People's Republic of China would, of course, try to fully reclaim its control over the island of Taiwan. And the way to do this is, you notice I have 2027 listed here. Why is that? Well, that is known as the Davidson deadline. And the reason why is because this was from Admiral Phil Davidson, who was the head of U.S. Pacific Command. And when he was leaving that post in 2021, in testimony before Congress, he said that the threat is manifest during this decade, in fact, the next 6 years. According to the information that he had, and this was also based on information regarding speeches that Xi Jinping has made internally, as well as looking at the preparations being made by China and their naval preparations. They're also their potential army preparations for an invasion. What they expect is a 2027 possible target date. Now, what's interesting is some have said that this, first of all, appears to be a moving up of a target date from what was 2035. The question is, and Xi himself has pushed back on this. He has said, no, why do people, he even made a statement during the recent meeting with Biden, why do people keep bringing up 2027? Like, this is not, because he's aware that people are bringing this up. The question is, did he actually say we're going to invade at 2027 or we're going to be ready by 2027? That was kind of the key question. And I know some individuals who could potentially be in a second Trump administration, and they think that it means they're actually going to do this by 2027. And of course, this is very critical because whoever is president next is going to be president in 2027. And so how they would handle that potential situation be very critical. What we do know is that what has become evident, and that's what's depicted by this map, is that China has increased its military exercises around the island of Taiwan. And they have done this in an increasing amount. If you were to look back at this map that shows, say, 2020, 2019, most of their military exercises would have been along the mainland coast. Since 2022 and then this year, they've been doing more exercises actually surrounding the island. And that is something they've been pointing to say, this seems like they are moving on that timeline of a potential 2027 attack. And so how would they handle, say, the third Taiwan Strait crisis? Because the U.S. and China, of course, have actually fought in the past in the 1950s over this. And what's interesting is that Trump has laid out that to respond, this was at the end of his previous administration, he wrote a strategic approach regarding Taiwan. And his administration wrote, to respond to Beijing's challenge, the administration has adopted a tolerance for greater bilateral friction, meaning they're willing to take this issue towards Taiwan, or towards China, even at the risk of conflict. And the reality is, kind of consistent with what I said before, Biden didn't seem to change that much. And I don't think Harris will either. I will make sure that America, not China, wins the competition for the 21st century, and that we strengthen, not abdicate our global leadership role. I think if there's one area where you would definitely see Harris be hawkish, it would be towards China. And I don't see that being very different between her or Trump. And so that is where I think in both cases, and this highlights something that I've pointed out in other writing I've done, that there really is kind of a China consensus in Washington. There are differences in how exactly to approach China, but there is a wide consensus in China, a cross-partisan consensus that China is a threat, one that is a key threat that has to be countered, and that China has designs towards Taiwan. And so because of that, I think when it comes to this issue, Harris and Trump would actually be quite similar in that regard. So what this leads to, this is the concluding point, and this is a phrasing that I think is kind of useful to think about, is we want to think about, are we going to be facing a Harris versus Trump type choice, or a Harris or Trump type situation? What's the difference? The difference is Harris versus Trump means they could both be handling the situations extremely differently. And we've laid out reasons for that. I said Harris is more value-based, Trump is more realpolitik. But I also laid out these wild cards that could actually lead Harris to behave more in a Trump-like way, or lead Trump to actually behave more in a Harris-type way. And so that's kind of the question is, are they actually going to be distinct, or would they truly be interchangeable? And, in many ways, Harris is going to try to stop Russia, oppose China, contain Iran. And Trump might, if it's different, he might allow Russia and China to have spheres of influence, but he's also going to still try to contain Iran. And so who is in charge would matter for U.S. foreign policy. That's if you're in a Harris versus Trump world. And that is possible. But I think the other possibility is that they both could be largely the same for reasons that I've laid out here. That both could actually approach the situation in a very similar way. They're both going to be focused on stopping Russia. They're both going to be focused on opposing China. They're both going to be focused on containing Iran. And so as a result, there could be that regardless of who's in power when it comes to addressing these security issues, you could see both of them end up taking a similar approach. And so what that would mean is that the foreign policy U.S. is really dictated by the U.S. position in the world, not who's in charge. So with that, I thank you very much for allowing me the time to be able to share these thoughts with you today. And I'm looking forward to now moving into a Q&A.
Professor Poast, I think that was absolutely fantastic. I think the whole idea of a liberal hawk as the next American president is certainly something that probably caught a lot of the audience here's attention. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask each of you a question and then ask you each to have a common question, and we'll see how much more time we have after that. But first, I'd like to go to Professor Gulotty. So what everybody heard here was the prospects of a global trade war, for sure. And my question to you is, what are the prospects of economic balancing against the United States in such a trade war? And then particularly, are there opportunities for China to lead that anti-American coalition so that we're not just talking about a trade war, but we're talking about some actual economic counterbalancing with China in the lead?
That's a great question. China has been spending the last 20 years attempting to build such a coalition around RCEP and other instruments that they have with their sort of foreign aid packages, their foreign investment packages, the One Belt, One Road strategy. And it's been a struggle for them to take on this leadership role. The way I suspect it will occur is that there will be increased economic ties between China and Europe. There will be counterbalancing in the sense that the firms that used to do business tied to the United States will now increasingly operate elsewhere. That will include places like Canada and Mexico, which currently have been 100% in the U.S. orbit and 100% part of the U.S. production process. They'll increasingly have to rely on outside markets if they face basically a tearing up of NAFTA, which is what this would amount to. I think it would be very difficult for the U.S. to find any partners willing to side with itself in such a fight. So it would be easy for other countries to sign their own trade agreements, to create their own organizations. And again, we're seeing this already in a number of fronts. So when the US pulled out of leadership at the WTO, Europe stepped in and created an alternative instrument. And other countries are participating in it, and they've created a parallel WTO structure that the US is not a party to, that other countries are using to solve their problems. Similarly, but that's not a Chinese-led initiative, and it's not one that's on the front burner like you would read about it in the New York Times every day, because they're not doing it for the purposes of challenging the United States, but rather because the rest of the world still has problems that they need to resolve, and they're going to come up with institutions and try to solve them. But the challenge that China has faced is that despite its best efforts to establish a sort of coalition against the United States around the world, the issue is the American market is still extremely lucrative, and the U.S. is very particular about who it does business with. And so, like, in a world in which the U.S. is not closing itself off from the rest of the world, it's been difficult for China to be a credible alternative. They don't have the internal economic growth right now that would be necessary to directly compete with the United States. They don't have the political institutions that are necessary to support markets. Other countries don't really trust the sort of negotiated deals that they've gotten into. There's a lot of blowback domestically within countries that have chosen the Chinese-led order. And so I think we haven't seen it yet because of the continued presence of America on the global stage. The alternative, we'll have to see what happens. I suspect that the negative consequences of this will be so severe for American markets that there would be a reevaluation of this strategy pretty quickly. I don't think if it would be like when Trump tried to default on the debt. There was a collapse immediately in the stock market, and they reevaluated whether that was really a good idea.
So I guess we're going to have a little down in order to save us from a much bigger down.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Yeah, that's terrific. So I now, Paul Poast, now just for the audience to know, Paul Poast is actually quite an expert on alliances and especially on NATO. And so I'd like to ask a question here about how if Trump really does do what he is promising to do, and the look on Zelensky's face when they met, it does seem like this is the case, that he's basically going to, quote, cut the deal at Zelensky's expense. That will have some effect on our credibility of our alliances going forward, certainly in Europe. But what I'd like to ask you, Professor Poast, is how the real possible consequences here in Asia of what the blowback will be from, again, the perception that the United States has abandoned Zelensky under Trump for our allies in Asia, and in particular, the prospects that what we'll end up seeing is bandwagoning. So you painted a lot of kind of horrific, sort of military scenarios, but I'm wondering if we have Trump, and if Trump does what he seems to be doing with Ukraine, what are the prospects of actually bandwagoning by where American allies in Asia will actually start to curry favor with China as the worst of two worlds?
I mean, it's a great question. I think it has been the question that has been, thinking about from a broader context, has been evident with the war in Ukraine since the beginning, as people have been asking, okay, does it stop with Ukraine, not just for Europe and not just for Russia, but would China learn lessons from this? And I even remember when we had an event where former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel was speaking about how China's studying this. They're learning from this. They're learning what mistakes has Russia made. And so there is absolutely a need to be thinking about the connections of what could happen in Ukraine, and not just what that would mean for Europe, but what that could mean specifically for Taiwan. And I think there's two possible views on this. One of them is a negative view towards Taiwan, which is kind of what you were alluding to, but one of them is actually a positive view. And I think either could happen with Trump. And in fact, if I had to put my money on the table, I would actually think the more positive view might happen towards it. But consistent with what I said during the talk, I think this positive view would also happen under Harris. So what is the negative view? Well, the negative view is what you laid out, that Trump will come in, he will say, this needs to end. We're cutting off support to Ukraine unless Europeans can pony up and give as much as they need to, but we're going to cut a deal to get this war over. That absolutely could happen. I actually am a little skeptical that will actually happen. I can elaborate a little bit on why that is, but let me lay out the positive scenario. That would be a negative scenario where one could take from that, say, well, Xi Jinping is going to look at that and say, oh, well, then great, the U.S. is going to abandon, therefore that must mean we can now go towards Taiwan. That would be the negative lesson. The positive lesson from it, and indeed the argument that I've seen people in the Republican Party make, is that, well, we need to refocus from Europe towards Asia precisely because we want to protect Taiwan, precisely because we view China as the bigger threat. Europe should handle Europe's problems because we need to be more focused there. And you can see that even if you look at like the recent funding bill that went towards 3 countries, Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Ukraine got the bulk of the money. Israel got the next bulk. And then even people who are in the Republican Party that are very much, they were like, this is unacceptable that Taiwan received a very small amount of that money. They said this needs to be reallocated. There needs to be more support going towards Taiwan because of this issue. So that would be the positive scenario, is they would say, well, the U.S. is actually going to refocus for that reason. Now, my wild card here, and I've been using that phrase a lot, but I think there, it kind of goes to a point that was raised earlier, which is that you can lay out trends, but there's always events that could happen that can shape foreign policy in unpredictable ways. So that's why I think we do have to think about these wild cards. It goes back to something I mentioned during my talk, is I actually think I do think if Trump were to be elected, I think he would actually start the process of trying to negotiate with Putin, just like he met with Kim Jong-un during his first time. And then what he will find is that Putin is not the same person that he was talking to when he was president. He will have basically a Tucker Carlson moment where, and I am referring to Tucker Carlson when he did his interview with Putin, and you can even tell by the look on his face, like, wow, Putin is going on for 30 minutes about some weird history that didn't really happen regarding Ukraine. And this is very odd, and I'm not sure what's going on here. And he's going to realize that actually that is where Putin's mind is, and that he's going to realize Putin is not giving in at all on anything on this issue. And I think that is going to shift Trump's focus quite a bit. And I think also that is, when you combine that with the possibility of playing to his ego, I think you could actually see Trump saying, okay, you know what? We tried to bargain. It didn't work. And I don't think you can work with Putin. And I'm getting people telling me we got to stand up to him, and tell you what, I'm going to do it better than Biden did. So I could actually see that kind of scenario playing out.
I hope both of you end up being right that Trump can ultimately be channeled either by events or by the Republican Party. But I do want to have one more minute before we end, because a number of questions came in about Hong Kong. And this is important here. So Professor Poast, you painted a picture of course, Harris as a liberal hawk, and Hong Kong, of course, could be a flashpoint there. But then Professor Gulotty, Hong Kong is a pretty important financial hub here as we get into all these tariff issues. So although there's slightly different scenarios, one would be Hong Kong under Harris, other Hong Kong under Trump. Professor Gulotty, could you just enlighten us a little bit about Hong Kong is a potential key point under Trump tariffs?
Trump position vis-a-vis Hong Kong is essentially that Hong Kong is China and a way to put pressure on China. So Trump's policy toward Hong Kong was to punish it, basically in response, and sanction it essentially in response to the changes in government that China's imposed on Hong Kong. And I think from his perspective, all of East Asia is suspect as a potential competitor to the United States. And again, the zero-sum perspective means that there's no love lost between him and anybody within the Chinese sphere or even neighbors of China. And so in the absence of any clear benefit to the United States to back up Hong Kong sovereignty or whatnot, I think he'll side with whatever the perspective that's in the room at the time necessary to satisfy them. So when the people who are China hawks came to the Trump administration and pitched how important it was to counter Chinese efforts, he was willing to do that, but at the same time, he'd be willing to abandon them in the next turn. I think it's 100% depending on who's in the room and who's telling him what, and whether he sees the transaction in a way that can benefit him and in some sense the United States.
Thank you very much. Well, it turns out we've run up against the time. And so as much as we'd like to keep going, we just can't. So I'm turning it back over to Mark.
Thank you, Professor. This has been fantastic this evening. I really appreciate each of your time. I have to say our students are so lucky, and our audience is very lucky to be able to hear each of your perspectives on this program. I do want to say that today we released the video from episode 1 with Professor Pape, so that is on YouTube now, and we'll be putting this episode online probably in the next 10 days. So thank you so much, professors. We really appreciate your time, and we look forward to the next episode of the U.S. presidential election series, which will be called Disinformation and the Domestic Political Implications. That's scheduled for 2 weeks from tonight, Thursday, October 17th at 8:30 p.m. Hong Kong time. Please register to listen to our UChicago experts' views on how voters process the political information they encounter and how their votes are likely to affect policymaking in Washington, D.C. So each one of these episodes in the presidential election series is giving a different take on each of the issues that we're looking at as it relates to the upcoming election on November 5th. Also, I just wanted to mention, not to shift gears too hard, but yesterday we opened our new heritage exhibition called Solomon Bard, Refugee and Renaissance Man here on the Hong Kong campus. You can scan the QR code on the screen and book your spot to visit this exhibition. This follows the award-winning 120 years of the Hong Kong Tramways exhibition that closed recently, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy this new exhibition on our heritage site. Also, don't forget to learn more about our UChicago faculty. I think we have about 130 episodes of our podcast called The Course, where you can listen to the professors who joined us tonight, each one of them, the professors who are going to be joining us 2 weeks from now on the 3rd episode of the Presidential Election Series program, and you can learn about how they became professors. That program, The Course, is produced here on the Hong Kong campus, and we like to feature as many UChicago faculty as we can so you can learn a little bit more about their backgrounds and how they became professors at the University of Chicago. Those are all my announcements for tonight. Again, thank you for our professors. Thank you for the audience for joining us. I hope everybody has a great evening. Thank you so much.